So now we have written a configuration for a pretty basic use case of just creating an EC2 instance and deploying it into a subnet. However, still with this simple configuration, we have over 100 lines of code all in one file, right? And the more resources we add and the more complex our infrastructure gets, we're gonna end up with a huge file where we just have an endless scroll of different resources and outputs and data and all of these components. And obviously now if you want to change something or adjust or find some resource definition, it's going to be very difficult. So in Terraform, we have a concept of modules to make our configuration not monolithic like we have here, so everything in one file, but rather more modular, right? So we basically break up parts of our configuration into logical groups and we package them together in folders, and these folders then represent modules, right? For example, logical grouping of resources could be that every resource that we need in order to create an EC2 instance will be packaged in one module, right? The instance itself, the AWS instance, the key pair creation, because we need the key pair for that instance to get the most recent image, and also security group because we're assigning the security group to EC2 instance. So this could be one logical grouping of the resources, and we can call that a web server instance or just virtual machine or whatever, and that will be basically a one module that we can reuse. So if we're deploying an infrastructure with multiple instances, for example, in different regions, different availability zones, we can reuse that same web server module in multiple different places. And the good thing is that whenever we define a module, we can pass in whatever parameters we want, right? We can parameterize any values that we want to pass from outside dynamically. And also we can access the output of the module, right? So whenever the resources get created that are part of a module, we can actually access the objects and its attributes afterwards, right? So if you're familiar with programming, actually think about modules as defining functions, right? So we write function once and we can reuse it in multiple different places in the configuration, and we can pass in parameters to that function and we can decide what these parameters are going to be, and we can return some values from the function, right? We can return an object with a bunch of attributes. And modules make the configuration much cleaner. It will make it easier to find the parts of configuration and resources that you have defined much easier because they're now logically grouped. One thing to note about modules is that whenever we are creating a module, it should be a proper abstraction of our resources. Meaning, it doesn't make sense to just have a module for creating an AWS instance, just one resource, right? Because then we just have an overhead of creating this whole new folder and a configuration file just for one resource, right? So it only makes sense to create a module when you want to group a couple of resources together into a logical group, right? As I said, creating a web server with all the configuration around it, like the firewall rules with security group, the key pair belonging to it, maybe the volumes that will be attached to it, and so on, right? Same thing with network configuration. For example, when we create a VPC, it needs subnets inside, it needs the internet gateway, the route table. So all of these could be one module called VPC. So that's important to know that you should actually be grouping several resources together so that creating a module makes sense. Now, we can create our own modules. However, for very common use cases, there are already modules created by Terraform or other companies or individual developers that we can reuse, right? So that not everybody has to create their own VPC module or their own IAM module for AWS specifically, and so on. So for different technologies, not just AWS, there are multiple modules. So if we go to Terraform registry, this is actually where the list of providers can be browsed. So we have seen AWS and a bunch of other cloud providers, Kubernetes, and so on. So these are the providers. And right next to it, you have a tab for modules. If I click inside, I have a list of modules that we can reuse instead of having to create them ourselves, right? And if we scroll here, we have a bunch of AWS modules that groups basically AWS resources together. And we also have Google Cloud modules and so on. And if we actually click in one of those, let's actually go with VPC module. You have a very nice documentation of what this module actually creates or which resources it groups together. So this will be the resources tab here. So it basically groups 152 resources that you can configure in this module, right? So basically it will create everything for you. You just have to provide the parameters for all those resources. And the parameters that you can provide are defined in Inputs tab. You have 408 parameters that you can pass in. And here's a list of definitions. Obviously, in most of the cases, you will just need a couple of them and not all of them, obviously. However, you have a possibility to define basically every single value of the resources defined in that module. And you also have the outputs. So basically this is what the resulting objects or resources that are creating using this module return. So you can use all these values as an output, right? For example, when you create the VPC with subnets, you need the VPC ID and subnet ID maybe to create other resources like EC2 instance and so on. And there will be in another module, right? So you have to use the output of one module in another by referencing those IDs, right? And you can do that because those values will be exposed. And you see those values and list of attributes in outputs. And you also have dependency section. And dependency basically describes whether this module contains or references other modules. In our case, it doesn't. So it basically creates everything from scratch with resources. However, it depends on a provider of AWS, which is logical because it creates a bunch of AWS resources. So it needs to have AWS provider. And that means that whenever you are using that module and you do Terraform init, all the providers that are defined inside the module will be automatically installed, right? So you don't have to define those providers in your main config file. You just reference the module, and with Terraform init, the providers in the module get installed. And if we go back, and another example, if we go into EKS, for example, you see, again, description of what this module actually does and the resources that it groups together. And here we have a longer list of providers that this module actually uses. So under the hood, it uses all those providers and resources from those providers. And when we do Terraform init, all of them will be installed. And if you want to use that module, you also have the basic usage example right here, where you can reference the source of the module like this. Now, this is just conceptual overview to understand what the modules are and that you can create your own modules, but also reuse the ones that AWS or Terraform created and reuse them to make it much easier. And in the next part, we are actually going to see all of these in action. We're going to be creating modules ourselves in our project, as well as using the existing ones from the Terraform registry.